Good morning, Prime Minister Trudeau. My name is Kimia Haidari, and I will be presenting to you today the Royal Proclamation Wampum Belt 2022, which signifies the renewed relationship between Canada and the Indigenous peoples and Canada's commitment to this renewed relationship. I would first like to begin by acknowledging that I am presenting to you today from Toronto, Ontario, which is covered by Treaty 13 and is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. I would like to give thanks to the lands and the ancestors. The Wampum Belt we present to you today is aimed at creating a covenant between Indigenous peoples in Canada to address the issues of water governance and land preservation. I will first outline what our Wampum Belt symbolizes and then present a brief overview of the issues, followed by a redress to those issues. Traditionally, the Indigenous peoples used Wampum Belts to signify treaties of friendship and peace, as well as to carry on their history throughout generations. Wampum belts are made of quahog shells, which are a round clamshell, and they are normally purple or white in color. They are drilled and made into beads, which are woven together by strings of varying color to make into wampum belts. The white beads of the wampum signify peace, purity, and good minds, and then the purple beads signify more serious matters, events, and agreements. Each bead of our wampum is woven together through yellow string, as yellow is on the eastern side of the medicine wheel, and it signifies sunrise or spring. This encapsulates our wampum's message of representing new beginnings and a new renewed relationship between Canada and the Indigenous peoples. Indigenous beliefs of spirituality is also emphasized within this wampum, as the Indigenous peoples believe that all creation has a spirit which is made equal and has equal right to land and water and equal right to govern their own affairs. By using yellow, which signifies spirituality, we embed every bead of the wampum with the spiritual nature. The symbolism of the two parallel lines seen here comes from the original two-rows wampum. One purple row represents the canoe of the Indigenous people, which encapsulates their traditions and their laws, and the other purple row represents the colonizers' boat or ship, which contains their traditions and their laws. Both lines run parallel to one another and never intersect, showing that each shall not interfere with one another's traditions and laws. The white row in the middle represents a path of peace, and how wide this path is represents how easy it is to walk this path of peace. Right now in our wampum, the path is quite narrow to show the current relationship between the Indigenous peoples and Canada due to the broken land treaties and the current pollution of the water systems. However, in future treaties to come and future generations to come, this row will widen. In the middle of our wampum belt are 7 white men, symbolized using a lighter shade of ivory, and 7 red men, symbolized using a darker shade of ivory, all holding hands in a circle. And they represent the 7 grandfather teachings. As long as the nations are united, this circle cannot be broken. Inside of the circle is the tree of peace, and that's symbolized using white beads. As has been told through oral tradition, the tree of peace was uprooted, and the 5 nations buried their weapons under this tree and replanted the tree. And in our wampum, this tree is protected by the 7 elders around the circle. We present the tree of peace as Canada's commitment to the Indigenous peoples that they will bury their weapons that have been historically used against the land and the water in order to renew this Treaty of Peace, the entire wampum is also encircled by a row of purple beads to once again signify Canada's commitment to this renewed relationship. I would next like to present a brief overview of the issues of land preservation and water governance. The Indigenous peoples have a very sacred relationship with the water, which is passed on to them through the Creator. The Creator had declared that all water in the world is sacred, holy, and that it has a spirit. Physically, water is used to quench thirst, clean and purify the body, and is spiritually used to carry and bring new life into the world and carry and send people back to the spirit world. Currently, the Indigenous peoples are disproportionately living with poor water quality and they lack access to clean water. Originally, the non-Indigenous peoples were given the right to access water and land resources. However, in breaking this treaty, the government has assumed full control of these resources, exploiting them, leaving Indigenous communities without access to these resources. The land that we are currently on was given to the Indigenous peoples by the Creator, and the Indigenous peoples in return follow the laws of the land made by the Creator. In following these laws, they agreed to limit activities that might harm the environment and ensure that resources are being used in a sustainable manner. Land preservation is not only an important spiritual aspect of Indigenous culture, but is also vital for Indigenous peoples to make a living. When entering into treaties with the colonizers, Indigenous peoples made this land preservation an integral part of their treaties. However, their intention was never to sell this land, and their intention was to protect this land for the generations to come. Treaty promises for the allocation of land to the Indigenous peoples was not implemented, and laws passed by the government, such as the Indian Act, further limited the Indigenous peoples' rights to make a sustainable living using the land. The government is disregarding the treaties made to ensure the environment was protected and that Indigenous communities had access to land that was not polluted or overexploited. The current treatment of the land by Canada's government sets to perpetuate the extinguishment of Indigenous rights and their connection to the land. This treatment further enhances the discriminatory basis of the doctrine of discovery, which established a unilateral ownership of the land by the colonizers, giving only a right to occupation by the Indigenous peoples. In order to address the issues of water governance, the Canadian government must recognize Indigenous peoples as creators of study and accept their contributions as it connects to their sovereignty and their nationhood. The current framework of Canadian water governance relies solely on Western science and fails to recognize approaches such as the two-eyed seeing by the Indigenous peoples. The two-eyed seeing approach will help the Canadian government in understanding the relationship that the Indigenous peoples have with water, with Canada's commitment to the two-eyed seeing approach, and their commitment in implementing Indigenous research methods within their water research. New policies can be created that respect the earth and its waters, which may restore the Indigenous peoples' rights to and access to clean water. In order to do this, Canada must recognize water as a living entity which encapsulates a spirit. Water walking will allow the Canadian government to understand the importance that water holds to the Indigenous peoples and why access to water is very important to Indigenous communities. In addressing the issue of land preservation, our firm proposes that the Canadian government reverts back to their treaty rights and acknowledges that this land was not sold and there is no land to give back to the Indigenous peoples as the land was never rightfully sold. Damaging laws such as the doctrine of discovery must be amended, and the Canadian government must recognize the damage that laws such as the Doctrine of Discovery have had on the Indigenous peoples. Once again, by implementing this two-eyed seeing approach, the Canadian government may be able to recognize that the land is given by the Creator and the Creator's laws must be followed. The proposed belt is an important symbol of Canada's acknowledgement of wrongdoing and their renewed commitment to the spirit of reconciliation. Thank you for taking the time to listen to our firm's presentation of our 2022 Royal Proclamation Wampum Belt. We thank you for your time, Prime Minister.